Young University in Provo. His expertise lies in digital archaeology, with his primary research focus centered on exploring the Fremont archaeological culture, which is situated within the eastern Great Basin and Colorado Plateau regions of the United States. So maybe around here a little bit. Scott has over 2 decades of experience in the field of archaeology, which includes a diverse array of projects spanning across the Great Basin, Midwest, Southwest, Northern, and Western Mexico, as well as the Middle East. His specialization encompasses archaeological excavation and surveying techniques, with particular emphasis on the study of ceramics and architectural structures made by the Fremont Native American peoples. Furthermore, he researches and implements advanced technology for archaeological investigations. And today, Professor Ure's presentation is titled Beyond the Pigment, New Insights into the Fremont Red on Gray Pottery in Northern Utah. Let's give a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you. Is this okay? We're on. All right. Thank you, Dr. Freeman. I appreciate that introduction. It's kind of long-winded. I need to cut it down a little bit, I think. It's really nice to be here this afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I've met a few of you and look forward to maybe talking to a few of you more after lunch, or during lunch. I also want to thank Dr. Freeman and, of course, Snow College for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor to be here in this beautiful valley and this historic campus. It's an amazing place. As mentioned, my talk today will focus on primarily Fremont pottery, but specifically pottery made in and around Utah Lake. Now, to begin, I want to start with a quote. Are we working? Okay, we're working. A quote from an archaeologist named Matthew Johnson in Northwestern University. He writes a lot about archaeological theory, and he says, quote, "Archaeology is fundamentally about human beings. It is nothing if not anthropological. And that archaeology must explain, it must ask why questions. We can do more than just describe and classify." Today, I hope to address a why question and come up with potential answers. And that's the case in archaeology. To come up with a definitive answer is pretty difficult. But we use anthropological theory, we use ethnographic analogy, and other social theories to help us interpret the archaeological record that we find. So that's my goal today, is to put forth a why question and then provide a couple hypotheses as to answers to that why question. So here's the outline as we go through the lecture today. I'll introduce to you first the Fremont archaeological culture. And we call them an archaeological culture because we don't really know anything about them other than the material that was left behind that we find in archaeological excavations. I will then talk about some research questions unique to this specific kind of pottery that we find around Utah Lake that's a red on gray style. I'll propose some hypotheses for why this is really different from other pottery, specifically painted pottery found throughout the Fremont region. And then I'll conclude with why those differences are really pretty important to Fremont studies in general. So that's the trip we'll take today, and at the end I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. So the Fremont. Who were the Fremont? And that's a loaded question in a lot of ways. But let's start with some chronology. If we look at the timeline of human population in at least this area of the world, in the Great Basin, which is where we are. We're on the eastern edge of the Great Basin. There's about 13,000 years, if not more, of people living in this area. We're going to talk about a really small sliver of time along that long chronology. Specifically, what we call the Fremont, which is a time period from about 400 to 500 AD, lasting until about 1300 AD. This was an interesting time in the Great Basin. There was a lot of change happening. And specifically, the Fremont were a unique part part of that change within this area. So this is the time frame we'll be looking at, around 500 AD to 1300 AD. The Fremont, as we understand today from archaeological research, were farmers. They were horticulturalists living here in this area, in the Sanpete Valley, all the way up into other parts of Utah. I'll show you a map here in a second, but primarily in the eastern Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau. Again, the time frame is that 400 to 1300 AD. People will probably debate with me on that, but give or take, that's the general timeline. We believe that the Fremont originated from migrant farmers who came up out of the American Southwest about 2,000 years ago. And that's really simplifying it, but generally that's the idea. Came in contact likely with indigenous peoples living here in this area, and were living together or probably interacting quite a bit. What's interesting is we really don't know what happened to the Fremont after about AD 1300. We slowly lose the archaeological record at that time. Radiocarbon dates from that time period tend to dip off. There's a lot of theories as to what happened, and I won't get into a lot of that. You can read the textbooks and see what people say in articles. It's really fascinating. We don't have any information about a written language of any kind or belief systems. We don't know much about their social organization aside from a few things. We do know that they were probably what we call Uto-Aztecan speakers. So, but there were probably divisions within those linguistic groups, and not everybody probably understood each other. So it was an interesting time and place here in Utah and among the Fremont. And a challenge for us as archaeologists is to try and decipher the past, because they left very little footprint on the landscape. Just a little bit, but not a lot. So in terms of the location of Fremont sites, if you look at the map, you can see the state of Utah. It's primarily habitation sites along that edge of what we call the Wasatch Front or the Eastern Great Basin. These are sites that are primarily habitation areas. Throughout the rest of this map, we would have found hunting camps and other smaller Fremont sites, but not with any evidence of architecture. If we look at how the Fremont, I will mention briefly too that in Sanpete Valley specifically, there are Fremont sites here, but very few are known. In fact, there's a site in Ephraim itself known as Witch's Knoll, and I guess we're pretty close to Halloween, so we can kind of go with the Halloween theme, but it's a great place to do additional archaeological research because very little has been done here, at least in terms of the Fremont. So in the Fremont, as I mentioned, were farmers. They were living in the well-watered valleys of the Wasatch Front. Much of the farmland today is where you'll find Fremont sites because it's good land to farm. It's rich soil. They were farming maize, beans, and squash, along with hunting and gathering deer and small game, fishing. Their settlements were, as I mentioned, these villages along these well-watered valleys and up into the Uinta Basin and out onto the Colorado Plateau. Artifacts include a lot of different things, and I'll show you a few here in a minute, but primarily plain gray pottery is the hallmark of the Fremont. You'll find it scattered throughout this area. And specifically, they had two painted types. So they had a black on gray bowl and a black on white. They didn't, I'll get into that in a second. But they also have a really unique style of rock art, really different moccasins, and some basketry techniques specific to them. So I want to show you what these look like. Just kind of get a glimpse of some of these artifacts. Some of them are quite incredible. On the left is a basket cradle board with a figurine of some kind in that cradle board. Now, what this was used for, we don't know. Could be a toy. It could be some kind of effigy of some sort. And this is where the archaeology is challenging because we want to understand exactly what this is. And often we have to come up with hypotheses, and that's the best we can do. On the right is a unique moccasin style specific to the Fremont. They are using the hock of a deer leg and using the dew claw, which are the two little kind of toes on the back of the deer, on the foot of the moccasin, probably to give them some traction when using this footwear. Really specific to the Fremont, and again, a hallmark of them. You may have seen these if you've been to the Price Museum. These are also often published in Fremont literature, for those of you who have read it. These are the Pillings figurines, and they are some of the more famous figurines found. What's amazing about these is that they give us an insight potentially into Fremont adornment and clothing, face paint, so you can see belts and kilts or skirts, necklaces. And what's really interesting is that those beads are very detailed in the figurines and mimic what we find archaeologically. So they're matching the actual items that they wore. And so we think this gives us some idea about clothing, which doesn't really survive in most cases in the Fremont world, aside from some cave sites that where that material is preserved. What's also interesting is we get an idea about gender. So we can see many of these figurines have what they look like are things on their shoulders. Those are actually hair bobs. So they're probably female figurines. Okay, one of my favorite Fremont artifacts is this owl pendant. Really rare, one of a kind that we know of, found at a site out on the border of Utah and Nevada. We think it was probably worn, but we're not exactly sure how it was strung. The holes don't seem to kind of line up with how it would be in a necklace format. But really interesting to see this idea of different motifs in the Fremont world. Owls are one specific that is replicated throughout. This is some Fremont rock art with lots of different animals, but specifically we have two owls. You can see elk, bighorn sheep, deer, bear, so probably a bear claw, and other small animals as well. Some handprints, just really amazing representations of the natural world. And specifically the elk are very detailed. They have that darker neck that you see on an elk with the long horns that typically go back over an elk's back. So they were very aware and observant of the world around them in the natural world. Here's another rock art panel. This is found up in the north near Vernal in Dinosaur National Monument. This is an individual probably holding weapons, so probably a shield and maybe some kind of weapon of some sort in the other hand, wearing a headdress, and then some really curious little kind of creatures around this individual with long horns and just different kind of ornaments. Again, these kind of give us some glimpses into the Fremont world. What it actually means, we don't know for sure. And that's, again, the challenge that we face, is trying to interpret the past based on very little information. Architecture. So these habitation sites, some of them were, especially in the late Fremont time period, so around 1000 to 11,000, or excuse me, 1100 AD, we start to see more kind of Puebloan Southwest style architecture. These are room block structures with storage, but we also still, in this example, this is down in Paraguna, Utah, which is kind of south central near Beaver. We also have pit houses, which were the older style of architecture. So you have kind of this mixture of the two styles of habitation. This is one of the larger Fremont sites excavated. That whole area in the Parowan Valley is one of the core kind of Fremont parts or villages in the Fremont world. What's interesting is that we also find some structures across various Fremont sites. So these are all cherry-picked from some sites that I studied. These are communal buildings. These were designed specifically for people to gather. They were so big that they couldn't have been built by just a single family unit. It would have required a community to build these structures. And so using some ethnographic data from people, some Native American tribes living earlier, so 1800 time periods when ethnographers were down in the American Southwest. We took those accounts and applied them to these structures to interpret them as communal space. So this could have been a place where village leaders would gather, or men groups or women groups would come, or if you had decisions to be made as a community, these are places where people could gather. So this gives us some glimpses, even if it's just a little bit, into what Fremont life would have been like and how they would have been socially organized. There were probably community leaders and various types of leadership of some sort that were organizing these meetings and using these spaces. Okay, so to get to kind of the heart of my presentation then, I want to show you some pottery. These are bowls. They're painted. We have black, what we call black on gray, really creative names, and black on white. These are the two major painted styles of Fremont pottery, and they're primarily bowls. So you can get a feel for what they look like just in these pictures. Here's another picture showing some other bowls, various designs. What's interesting is that Fremont painted pottery clearly has origins in the Southwest. If you've ever traveled to New Mexico, Arizona, you'll see these patterns and motifs even today in modern Puebloan pottery production. These designs clearly come from those origins in the Southwest. This is one of the reasons we think that the Fremont were originally from that area and migrated north. But the Fremont kind of have their own twist on their painted pottery. They have a subtle consistency to their design. They didn't ever get into what we see in the ancestral Puebloan world in the Four Corners, so in Mesa Verde area and elsewhere, Chaco Canyon, of what we call red wares and orange wares, these kind of bright colors, no polychromes. They keep it very simple. The Fremont pottery is black and gray, black on white. That's the majority of what we find across the Fremont world. So if we look at the production zones of these, the true primary black painted pottery are what we call Snake Valley black on gray. That was made mostly in the Parowan Valley, so again near Beaver, Cedar City area. The black on white is what we call Ivy Creek black on white, produced probably in the Sevier Valley, well, probably east of Sevier Valley, in the Ivy Creek area, thus the name. Like I said, we get really creative with our names. This pottery, like I said, is found all across the Fremont world, at campsites, procurement zones, habitation areas. They're really the two major produced and traded wares. But there are some others that are not as well represented, and that's what I'll talk about today. You'll notice right off the bat, this is very different. This is Fremont red on gray pottery. It was noted in past research and other studies throughout the last several decades, but it's just been understudied, largely ignored, I think in part because it's hard to identify sometimes, and often the paint will rub off, and so it will look like just a plain gray piece of pottery. We're realizing, though, that it actually is widely more widespread than we realized, and that most of it is centered around northern Utah, but primarily Utah Valley, and around the lake specifically. And so some new excavations, some new data really prompted us to reevaluate Fremont red on gray in a new way, because it is so different from that really dominant black on gray and black on white pottery. So the research questions that we have about red on gray pottery are that we notice that it is a significant deviation from these really strong painting traditions of the black on gray and black on white pottery. We posit that it was a northern painting tradition specifically, but we want to know, why is it so different? Why is it so radically different in some ways? And I'll get into that, the radical nature of this pottery. We suggest then that in our research that Fremont red on gray may actually represent a way of actively expressing social identity in a way that intentionally diverts from the dominant painted styles found in the Parowan Valley and the Emory area. Now, why do they want to identify themselves in a different way? It's a really good question, and I'll get into a little bit as I go along. As I mentioned, there was some previous research in past publications. Rex Madsen, Dave Madsen both did some analysis on red on gray. Watkins, my friend of mine, Chris Watkins, recommended that red on gray be added to all Fremont pottery styles so that we start looking for it more closely. It's clear that it's a variant that's warranted and needs further exploration. Our study looked at 43 sites from the north area up, just up near the Great Salt Lake, all the way down to the Parowan Valley in a place called Median Village. So we looked at sites all throughout the Wasatch Front. And my colleague specifically did all of the analysis on this pottery to document it, and noticed that his analysis was finding a lot of sherds we hadn't seen before. And it's made a huge contribution to Fremont ceramic studies in general. If we look at the numbers, red on gray pottery is produced primarily out of what we call Great Salt Lake gray. So this is just a very plain gray pottery, again, mostly in the north. And if you look at the numbers, over 70% of red on gray pottery is found in this, what we call a temper type, this Great Salt Lake gray. It's found in other areas, but not nearly in the same numbers as in the Great Salt Lake gray of the northern Utah area. And if we look at some GIS analysis of the distribution of red on gray, it's a bullseye right around Utah Lake. This is really, if you've studied Fremont pottery for a long time like I have, this is really strange. The distributions of the black on gray and black on white bowls, I should have a map of that, but you will see that it spreads all the way across Utah, north to south, east to west. So this is really different, very centered in a very specific geographic area. And there's one site in particular called Wolf Village, which is near Goshen, Utah, the thriving metropolis of Goshen. And it has a huge number of red on gray pottery. It's the anomaly in the entire distribution. It's almost more than double all the sites combined. Now, in part, it's probably because we've done a lot of excavation there. But we do think that it probably is what we call the type site for red on gray, where it was the primary production area for this pottery. It's a really beautiful place, too. Great place to work and excavate. So in specific, the details of red on gray pottery, it's applied almost exclusively to jars and pitchers, so not to bowls, which is, again, the exact opposite of the black painted. It's variation in craftsmanship. There's a lot of variation in it. The line widths vary. It's just kind of crudely made. It's not nearly as tight in execution. It's also found, as I mentioned, in all the different temper types, but primarily in the Great Salt Lake gray type. Again, it's made primarily in Utah Valley, maybe a little bit up in Salt Lake Valley. Just some examples to show you now of if you'll compare this to the black on gray and black on white pottery I showed you earlier, it's a pretty clear difference. Again, no bowls, just jars and pitchers, and in these kind of crudely painted designs on these sherds. These are from that Wolf Village site. This is a red on tan, what we call a red on tan variant. So they were oxidizing the pottery. They were allowing oxygen to get into the clay while it was firing. Also unique in some cases to red on gray. Not entirely, there's other Fremont, but for the most part, Fremont pottery is known as gray ware because it's fired in a reduction environment, meaning that it's buried with fire so that no oxygen can get in. And it gives it a really rich gray color. So again, with red on tan, we're seeing a different production technique to make this pottery. Again, a why question. Why would they do that? Here's another example, more red on gray. Again, just kind of crudely made in some ways. But then there's some really interesting ones. This is a bird effigy jar from that Paraguna site. You can see kind of the body of the bird. It's broken. We had to glue it back together, but then painted designs on the handle and throughout the body. Here's another bird effigy jar from Snake Rock Village down in central Utah. Red paint, although it's kind of faded, but red painted designs along the neck and around the beak. Design analysis shows we didn't have any reconstructed vessels to look at, so we're only looking at pottery sherds. We couldn't really look at layouts or symmetry. So we focused on primarily absence and presence of design elements. We noticed that the quality, again, of production on these is limited as compared to the black painted vessels. They're kind of uneven, rough, and limited in patterns. I want you to also see now red on gray designs are primarily around using triangles and kind of curved lines. They don't include a lot of the other painted elements that we find in the black on gray and black on white bowls. Again, another question, why is that the case? Why are we seeing such a difference between the two? So if we look at the production areas then, we already saw that the black bowls were painted primarily in the Sevier Valley, Huron Valley area. But they were widely traded, so these were probably socioeconomic items. They were used for trade and sale all the way up and down the Wasatch Front. The red on gray was produced, as I mentioned, up in the north in Utah Valley. So different production areas geographically separated, but the red on gray was not widely traded. In contrast, if we look at the painted designs of these bowls, these black and white and black on gray bowls, they're consistent, they're crisp, they use triangles, interlocking scrolls, other elements, other design elements, very southwest again, dots, diamonds, boxes, all kinds of design elements. They don't have any anthropomorphs or zoomorphs, pretty rare, but they have planned layouts and designs, symmetry, just really very different. So just to outline these differences. So the most obvious is red paint, right? The red paint versus black paint, very different. Red on gray is mostly painted on jars and pitchers, less than 1% are painted on bowls, whereas the black on gray and black on white are almost all bowls and not jars and pitchers. So hopefully I'm kind of belaboring the point a little bit, but we're seeing a real big difference here. The line widths are different, they're uneven with red on gray, whereas they're very even often with the black on gray and black on white. Produced in different areas, and the red on gray was not traded. It's very localized, it didn't move around, whereas the black on gray and black and white was traded. So again, just to show very different design elements between the two. The red on gray didn't have any of these design elements that we see with the black on gray and black on white. So why the differences? So let's get into the why question. Why did the potters in the north around Utah Valley deviate from this long-standing painting tradition in the south? It's difficult to know exactly why this happened, but we have some theories. So here are my 3 ideas. One is creative innovation. You just want to do something different. Second is there could be significance in the color red specifically. Does it have some meaning? And then thirdly, is this some way of people in the north expressing their identity or group membership? So creative innovation is a way to differentiate from current trends. It's a way to look different, to dress different, to have something different, or to show your identity in a different way. It often is used to resist social norms and structures that are the dominant norms of the time. Sometimes it's driven by socio-economic decisions. So who's going to get the new iPhone 16, right? You want the next new thing. So innovation is an important part of that. Sometimes innovation is a way to transmit and maintain secret knowledge as far as how to make the pottery or how to design it. It flourishes in peripheral areas as well, often away from kind of the core central places where you have the creative living out in the middle of nowhere making cool stuff, right? So these are kind of some patterns that we see when we look at sociology and psychology, the way people think about innovation. We also can use ethnographic accounts, specifically from the American Southwest, because we feel the Fremont have connections to them. Some colors and designs are considered dangerous among Native American groups, especially for those who are uninitiated in using those colors or designs, or who don't have the authority to use them. Sometimes they're considered intellectual property, so people who make those designs are controlling who gets to use them. Sometimes potters will keep those designs and colors and elements they use to make their pottery secret so that others can't take advantage and use them to make their own stuff. And particularly because sometimes identities are wrapped around the skill set and to make that pottery. So if we look at creative innovation among the Fremont, we can see a widespread trade of these black painted bowls. We know that they're primarily made for trade. Whereas we think red on gray potters deliberately avoided competing with that trade network specifically. And perhaps they were even trying to develop their own in the north, in the Utah and Great Salt Lake areas. Perhaps they were also trying to avoid intellectual property issues or some kind of negative consequences with using these designs on these bowls. Perhaps they weren't authorized or allowed to use them. What this suggests to us, though, that we do know, or this does say to us, that there was a well-established Fremont trade network. So it gives us an added piece to our puzzle about Fremont trade systems and interactions, that there was somebody who was managing that system. Okay, third hypothesis is the power of color, or the significance of color. Again, we draw from ethnographic accounts from the American Southwest. For many Native American groups, color is really important to both the physical and spiritual world. It symbolizes direction, group affiliation, can be involved with medicine and curing ailments, often affects weather and other really important integral parts of their lives. As I mentioned, red can be associated with the cardinal direction south and also is connected to various plants and animals and other natural phenomena. For the Hopi specifically, red is associated with men and hunters, warriors, other elements listed there. And among the Navajo, the red can symbolize protection. So color is meaningful in the Native American world and has a lot of different, and is integral to their lives. If we look at the Fremont, again, we have limited information, but we assume that color was socially and ritually meaningful to them. It may have been connected with direction and ritual and power, cosmology, all those things. We just don't know for sure. This rock art panel is a Fremont panel that shows, we call it I think we call it the circle of love, or the circle of love. A bunch of people holding hands around the circle. Archaeologically, we do know about color use. You've seen some. So red used on rock art, on the pottery, black and white used on paint, on ceramic vessels, yellows and oranges on figurines and rock art, and then we have a little bit of a splash of blue and green with some turquoise pendants. Here's one of those bichromatic rock art panels using red and white. This is down near Muddy Creek, near Farron, just kind of south of here. Some more examples of color in the Fremont world. This is the bottom of a bowl with kind of a red paint. A really beautiful figurine with red and orange face and a red sash across the body. And then some gaming pieces. These we think were some kind of bone dice that had red on one side and then plain on the other. So just some examples of the color in the Fremont world. Then, of course, these beautiful turquoise pendants. These were found at Baker Village, which is a site on the Nevada-Utah border. Probably one of the more amazing Fremont artifacts to show the power of color is this red-shafted flicker feather headdress. Say that 3 times fast. And what's amazing is right in the middle it has yellow flicker feathers. You can kind of see them right in the center of the headdress itself. The past would have been a brilliantly beautiful, colorful place. And we just get bits and pieces of a glimpse of what it would have looked like in the archaeology. Okay, and so lastly, my final kind of hypothesis, I'll explain why I have a Scottish tartan on there, because that's a real different direction. But we think that red on gray pottery may have been some way of actively expressing group identity, or some kind of group membership or social identity. So identity is a way for people to identify themselves within a specific or diverse social group. Examples would involve like your kin group, your clan, your socioeconomic status, age, or your religious affiliation. But we have both active and passive ways of representing that. Actively, we can be deliberate in what we wear, what symbols we put on, what memberships we belong to. For example, I'm of the Campbell clan in Scotland. That's where my last name comes from, thus the example. But we have a lot of identities that often overlap each other. We also passively identify ourselves in our mannerisms, our slang, our dialect. And these are less accurate because they can be, or excuse me, they're more accurate because they're not as manipulable. That's not even a word. You can't manipulate them, right? And so how does this apply to the archaeological record? Well, Ian Hodder, a famous archaeologist out of Stanford, said, quote, "If pots are used to form group membership, it is clear that pots must be visibly different from group to group." We definitely see that with the red on gray. He also said, quote, "Types of pottery which are used as symbolic markers of group identity form distinct spatial patterns." We're also seeing that with red on gray, and leave a distinctive and recognizable trace in the archaeological record. So is red on gray being used as a way to actively show membership in a specific group? We know that pottery is used to transcend more than just a utilitarian purpose. And it contains both active and passive information about the maker and the user of the pot. The active elements would be form, design, paint, color. The passive is the stuff that is unseen but is involved in material choice and coiling techniques, smoothing, manufacturing, and even the sequence of construction. These are done and passed from generation to generation and becomes habitual. And you make it in a certain way because that's how grandma made it, and that's how her grandma made it. And it creates this passive pattern that we can identify in archaeological material. So if we look at red on gray pottery, and does it represent this kind of expression of identity? I kind of think it is signaling group affiliation. Actively, specifically, these dramatic differences in form and color, it's not widely traded. It's possible that the painting and production techniques are also associated specifically with the North. And we think that this was an intentional choice, a way to diverge from the norms of this dominant black and gray and black and white pottery tradition. So to wrap up in conclusion here of my presentation, we think that red and gray pottery was possibly reinforcing some kind of boundaries along that north-south region between Utah Lake and areas south, but specifically around Utah Lake. And we think that these overt identity symbols were used potentially to mitigate competition, specifically for resources around Utah Lake, which were very plentiful. Waterfowl, fishing, great farmland. And so perhaps red on gray was kind of a no trespassing sign, a way to say this is our space. If you're coming through here, you need to let us know. I don't know, these are some interpretations of what this pottery could have been used for. We also think that red and gray pottery in the northern region may exemplify this pattern of integration within a larger Fremont archaeological culture. So they were part of the larger group, but they were still identify themselves as a specific area within that larger group. Just want to finish by saying thank you to a lot of people that were involved, but specifically Dr. Freeman for inviting me, and then my research colleagues, also landowners that helped us work on their property and collect artifacts, and then Department of Anthropology at BYU, Department of History and Snow College here, and then a couple museums that helped us out as well. That's it. Thank you. I know we're tight on time, but we're good?
Yeah, I think we're pretty good, actually.
Okay.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. And so we'll have TAs as usual. We'll have microphones, and so take a second to think about your questions, and then raise your hand when you have one.
You guys don't ask me, I'll start asking you. So.
Right.
Yeah, back there.
Hey.
Go ahead, yeah. Oh, we're waiting for the mic, sorry.
I was wondering, when it comes to, you said that going
going off with the pottery, there was like grandma made it, and there was some repetition with some, what's the word I'm looking for? With some presence of pattern. Can you distinguish any kind of like social norms and stuff from the pottery alone, or is it more along the lines of what you find at the archaeological sites?
Great question. Yeah, the pottery tells us a lot, and specifically those passive ways of production. I wrote an entire master's thesis on this question, so there are techniques, so how the coils overlap each other. Fremont initially coiled their pottery in a specific way. It was very unique to the Fremont, and so that was one thing we could key in on. As time moved on, they actually reverted that coiling and used a different technique. But so coiling, even like the shapes and depth of how they incise the clay, the painted designs, these are all these little elements in how the pottery was made that we can read, I guess, as almost a book in some ways. Whether our interpretations are right is up for debate, but yeah, those are the little details, and that's one of the things as an archaeologist is really like zeroing in on those details and looking at them and seeing if they tell you something. And often when we start to see patterns in those, that's when we start to see more information about the norms, right? How things were made and when they changed. That's the other question, is why did they change? More questions. Love it. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation, Dr. Gear.
Yeah.
I have a question. Well, I have two, and you can take or leave, whatever seems relevant, about the coils and also about the name Fremont.
Yeah.
So I can't remember if it's with Fremont culture or other pottery styles, or if this applies to any of them. But aside from being pretty or looking cool and stylized,
Yeah.
did the coils in some cases have like give a vessel heat distribution, like they absorb or distribute the heat differently depending on kind of the surface area? That's one thing I feel like I've seen at some point, but I can't remember if it applies here. And then
Yeah.
my other question is, so we have this name Fremont that's a kind of, conventional name for the culture, and sounds like there's other more specific ones to different regions.
Yeah.
What does the conversation look like in anthropology about naming? I've seen different things on interpretive signage at different state parks too, maybe suggesting alternatives, or maybe those are specific to places.
Right.
Any of that you care to speak to? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the functional elements of the coils, I haven't personally done studies, but I know others have, and specifically looking at corrugated pottery. So this is pottery where the coils are left, and then little tiny indentations are made all the way around the coils. There's some thought that improves the thermodynamics of the pot, so it helps to heat up the water. And I'm trying to remember, there's some papers published on this where they actually looked at the thermal properties, and I'm trying to remember their conclusions. I don't think they really saw much difference in that, so especially compared to just a plain coiled pottery with smooth exterior, interior. So we don't really know if it really added to the actual functionality of the pot itself, specifically. As far as the name Fremont goes, obviously that's a name that was given to the archaeological material that we found. The name was first used during what we call the Claflin-Emerson expedition, which was in the late 1920s, early 1930s. It was a group of people mostly working along the Colorado Plateau out in eastern Utah, came across artifacts on the Fremont River, which is just southeast of here, and thus the name stuck. Now, unlike the ancestral Puebloans of the Four Corners, previously known as the Anasazi, that's a name we don't use anymore, primarily because it has kind of negative connotations with its translation as the ancient enemy, I believe. So that in the literature has changed to ancestral Puebloan. A lot of Native American tribes prefer we use the name their traditional names. With the case with the Fremont, we don't know, and so there hasn't really been a lot of consultation with other tribes to determine a proper name to use. But I think in the future that's something we need to definitely evaluate. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Could be. We do know that potters making the red on gray pottery clearly interacted with potters from all over the area because of the exchange. We find black on gray and black on white pots at red on gray sites. So they knew about it, they were aware of it, but they chose to do it in a different way. And why it was done in a less, in a kind of a simple, kind of crude way, we don't know. Other than to just differentiate from the other, the classic stuff, right? It seems expedient almost, like just quickly slapped on there, and you get a variation, but they were aware of the nice stuff, the fine stuff, but chose not to mimic it for some reason. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
It is about 1:20 right now, so if you do have a class, I think you can feel free to leave. But I know that Professor Ewer is more than happy to talk with anybody who wants to stay around. If you want to come up and talk to him on your own. If any of you do want, if one of you wants to stay for lunch, come here. But let's give a last round of applause for Representative.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, no problem. Thanks. Nice.